In the winter of 1874, a whisper ran through the Wyoming Territory about a man named Silvio Kincaid, a ghost of the Rockies who reportedly hated civilization enough to shoot a whiskey glass out of a man's hand from 300 yards. But the true legend wasn't his aim. It was the day he rode into the mining camp of Blackwater Ridge and slapped a bag of raw gold dust onto a barrelhead to purchase 4 trembling sisters from their own flesh and blood. History books might miss the small details, but the town of Kincaid's Hollow stands today as living proof and that sometimes the scariest men have the biggest hearts. This is the true untold story of how a hermit saved 4 lives and how they, in turn, saved him. The wind howling through Blackwater Ridge carried the scent of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and desperation. It was November 1874, 3 years after the great financial panic had strangled the economy, leaving men desperate and morals loose. The mining camp, a festering sore on the side of the Bighorn Mountains, was no place for children, yet 4 of them stood shivering on the porch of the Salty Dog Saloon. Mary Ellen, the eldest at 19, stood like a stone statue, her chin high despite the bruises blooming on her wrist. She shielded her sisters, Ruth, 16 and fiery-eyed, Verity, 12 and silent as a grave, and little Pearl, who was only 6 and clutching a rag doll that had lost one of its button eyes. Standing before them was Elias Rook, their uncle. He was a man who looked like he was made of gristle and malice, with tobacco stains in his beard and a soul blackened by greed. After their father died in a mining collapse and their mother succumbed to fever a week later, Rook had swooped in not as a savior, but as a vulture. He had sold the family farm in Nebraska, pocketed the cash, and dragged the girls west, promising a new life. That new life was currently being negotiated with a man named Frenchy, a brothel owner from Cheyenne, with a velvet coat and teeth that looked too white for his face. "400 for the lot," Frenchy said, inspecting his fingernails, "though the little one is useless to me for years. Just another mouth to feed." "She cleans," Rook spat, glaring at Pearl. "And the big one, Mary Ellen? She's strong. Reads, too, if you have a need for a girl with airs." Mary Ellen tightened her grip on Pearl's shoulder. She had a knife hidden in her boot, a rusty paring blade she'd stolen from their last camp. She had already decided that if Frenchy tried to touch them, she would use it. Whether on him or herself, she hadn't decided yet. The crowd of miners and drifters watched with dull interest. In the West, tragedy was just Tuesday. No one moved to help. The law was 3 days' ride away, and the sheriff was likely on Frenchy's payroll anyway. 500, Rook demanded. "I got gambling debts, Frenchy. 500 or I take 'em to Deadwood." Frenchy sighed, reaching for his money roll. "Fine, 500. But you sign over guardianship. I don't want no trouble later." The transaction was nearly complete when the saloon doors swung open, not with a bang, but with a sudden, freezing draft that silenced the room. The man who filled the doorway was a giant. He wore a coat made from a grizzly bear, the fur still thick and dark, and a hat pulled low over eyes that looked like shattered flint. He smelled of pine resin, dried blood, and solitude. A Sharp's buffalo rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, the barrel longer than a man's leg. This was Silvio Kincaid. The locals called him the Angry Man of the Mountain. He came down once a year for supplies, salt, coffee, bullets, and spoke to no one. Silvio walked to the bar, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He slapped a list on the counter. The bartender, a nervous man named O'Malley, scrambled to fill it. Rook, emboldened by the whiskey in his belly and the cash almost in his hand, sneered. "Close the damn door, mountain trash. We're doing business here." Silvio didn't turn. He just waited while O'Malley sacked up coffee beans. Frenchy laughed nervously. "Ignore him, Elias. Here's your money." Pearl, terrified by the loud voices, let out a small, sharp sob. It was a tiny sound, barely audible over the wind, but Silvio Kincaid's head tilted. Just an inch. He turned slowly. His gaze swept over the saloon, past the drunk miners, past the smirking Frenchy, and landed on the 4 girls. He looked at Pearl's tear-streaked face, then at the bruises on Mary Ellen's wrist. Finally he looked at Elias Rook. "What is this?" Silvio's voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "None of your concern," Rook snapped. "Family matter. Selling off my burden so I can head to California. Frenchy here is taking them in as maids." Maids, Silvio repeated. He looked at Frenchy. That true? Frenchy puffed out his chest. Sure. Domestic help. Now run along, bear man. Silvio walked over to the porch. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He stopped in front of Mary Ellen. He towered over her, frightening and wild, a creature more beast than man. You want to go with him? Silvio asked her. Mary Ellen looked into his eyes. She expected to see madness. Instead, she saw a strange, deep stillness. No, she whispered. He's a devil. Silvio nodded. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the barrel Frenchy was using as a table. It landed with a heavy thud that shook the wood. Gold, Silvio said. Raw dust, uncut. Worth more than 500. The room went dead silent. I'm buying them, Silvio said. Rook's eyes bulged. He reached for the bag, opening it. The glitter inside was unmistakable. It was easily $1,000 worth of nuggets. Sold. Rook screamed, grabbing the bag before Frenchy could object. Wait just a minute, Frenchy shouted, his hand dropping to the derringer in his pocket. We had a deal. Silvio didn't blink. In a motion too fast for a man of his size, the barrel of the Sharps rifle swung up, stopping an inch from Frenchy's nose. Deals changed, Silvio said softly. Unless you want to see what a .50 caliber slug does to a velvet coat. Frenchy went pale. He raised his hands and backed away. Silvio turned to Rook. The guardianship papers. Sign them over to me. Now. Rook scribbled his name so fast the pen nearly tore the paper. They're yours, Kincaid. Good riddance. They eat like horses and whine like dogs. Silvio took the paper. He looked at the girls. Get your things. We leave now. We don't have things, Ruth said, her voice trembling but defiant. Just what we're wearing. Silvio frowned. He took off his massive bearskin coat and draped it over Mary Ellen and Pearl. It swallowed them whole. Let's go, he said. As they walked out into the snow, leaving a stunned silence in the salty dog, Mary Ellen looked back at her uncle clutching his gold. She didn't know it then, but that gold would be his death sentence. And she didn't know that the monster walking in front of them wasn't leading them to hell, but to the top of the world. The journey up the mountain was a grueling 3-day trek that tested every ounce of the sisters' resolve. Silvio didn't speak. He moved with a relentless, rhythmic pace, his snowshoes crunching over the powder, breaking a trail for the girls to follow. The first night, they camped in a shallow cave protected from the wind. The girls huddled together, terrified. They whispered among themselves while Silvio prepared a fire. He's going to eat us, Verity whispered, her eyes wide. I heard stories. Mountain men take wives and eat the children. Hush, Mary Ellen said, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. He paid a fortune for us. You don't pay gold for food you can shoot in the woods. Maybe he wants wives, Ruth said, her face grim. All of us. If he tries, Mary Ellen said, touching her boot where the knife was hidden, he'll bleed. Silvio sat by the fire, skinning a brace of rabbits he'd snared earlier. He seemed to ignore them completely. He roasted the meat, split it into 4 generous portions, and handed it to them on clean bark slabs. Eat, he grunted. Aren't you eating? Pearl asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. Silvio looked at her. Ate yesterday. He took his rifle and sat at the mouth of the cave, facing the dark woods, his back to them. He sat there all night, a silent sentinel watching for wolves. He never slept. By the second day, the altitude began to hurt. The air grew thin, and the cold was a physical weight. Pearl stumbled, her legs giving out in the deep snow. Silvio stopped. He turned back, walked to Pearl, and without a word, scooped her up. He placed her in the pack on his back, nestled among the flour and coffee. Hold on, he said. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, Mary Ellen said stiffly. He glanced at her. Name's Silvio. Save your breath for climbing. That afternoon, they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The world spread out beneath them, white and jagged and beautiful. But the beauty was lost on the girls, who were freezing and exhausted. Why? Ruth suddenly shouted, stopping in her tracks. Why did you buy us? If you aren't going to hurt us, and you aren't going to use us, why waste your gold? Silvio stopped. He looked at the horizon, his jaw working beneath his beard. Because, he said, his voice rough. I knew a man like your uncle once. and I know what happens to girls who go with men like Frenchie." "That's not an answer," Ruth challenged. Silvio turned his dark eyes on her. "It's the only one you're getting. Keep moving. Storm's coming." They reached his cabin just as the blizzard struck. It wasn't a shack, it was a fortress. Built from massive ponderosa logs, notched perfectly, it sat on a plateau, sheltered by a granite overhang. A plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney that looked like it had been built by a master mason. He ushered them inside. The warmth hit them like a physical blow. The cabin was surprisingly clean. There were shelves lined with books, Shakespeare, Plato, engineering manuals. There was a workbench covered in intricate wood carvings, and in the corner, a dusty piano that looked like it had been hauled up the mountain piece by piece. "The loft is yours," Silvio said, pointing to a ladder. "There are furs up there. Stay warm. Don't touch the tools." The girls climbed up, collapsing into a pile of soft buffalo robes. They fell asleep instantly, the sound of the wind howling outside, unable to reach them in this sanctuary. Down below, Silvio sat in his rocking chair. He looked at the guardianship papers in his hand. He read the names: Mary Ellen, Ruth, Verity, Pearl. He opened a locket he kept around his neck. Inside was a faded daguerreotype of a woman and a baby. "I didn't leave them, Martha," he whispered to the empty room. "I couldn't leave them." For the first time in 10 years, Silvio Kincaid wasn't alone in the cabin. The silence he had cherished for so long was gone, replaced by the soft breathing of 4 children who had no idea that they had just been adopted by the most dangerous man in the territory. But the danger wasn't inside the cabin. It was coming from down the mountain. Elias Rook had spent his gold, and greed is a fire that never burns out. The first week in the cabin was a siege of silence. The girls moved like ghosts, afraid that dropping a spoon or coughing too loudly would turn the bear man violent. But Silvio Kincaid was not a man of random violence. He was a man of absolute, terrifying routine. He woke at 4. He chopped wood at 4:30. He checked the trap lines at 5. By 6, the smell of sourdough biscuits and venison sausage filled the cabin. Eat was his morning prayer. Work was his benediction. He didn't treat them like maids, as their uncle had threatened. He treated them like recruits. One morning, 2 weeks into the deep freeze of December, Mary Ellen found a pile of buckskin and heavy wool on the table. Beside it sat bone needles and sinew thread. "Clothes," Silvio grunted, sharpening his skinning knife by the fire. "Those city rags you wear will kill you. Frostbite takes toes first, then fingers. So." Mary Ellen, whose hands were calloused from scrubbing floors but skilled with a needle, took the lead. She taught her sisters to stitch the heavy leather. As they sewed, the cabin transformed from a prison into a workshop. The fear began to thaw, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Verity, the 12-year-old who rarely spoke, was the first to breach Silvio's perimeter. She found him at his workbench one evening, filing the delicate gears of a pocket watch. She watched him for an hour. "The escapement is bent," she whispered. Silvio stopped. He turned to look at her, his monocle magnifying one eye. "You know mechanics, girl?" "My father. Before the mines. He fixed clocks," Verity murmured. Silvio slid the watch towards her. "Fix it." It was a test. Verity's small fingers worked the tools with trembling precision. When the watch began to tick, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat, Silvio nodded. It was the highest praise he could offer. From that day on, Verity wasn't allowed to scrub dishes. She was at the workbench, learning the physics of leverage, pulleys, and gears. Ruth, the 16-year-old with fire in her veins, found her place outdoors. One afternoon, a timber wolf, starving and desperate, stalked them while they were gathering kindling. The girls froze. Silvio emerged from the trees, the Sharp's rifle leveled. But before he could fire, Ruth threw her hatchet. It spun through the air and struck the wolf in the shoulder, turning its charge into a stumble, giving Silvio the split second he needed to drop the beast with a single, clean shot. Silvio walked over to the dead wolf, then looked at Ruth. He didn't smile. He pulled a Colt Navy revolver from his belt and handed it to her, butt first. "A hatchet is luck," he said. "This is certainty. Tomorrow, we shoot." And so the winter passed. It was a brutal education. Silvio taught them that the mountain was an indifferent god. It would kill the careless and the weak without malice. He taught them to read the clouds for snow, to listen to the birds for warning, and to walk without breaking a twig. But the most profound change happened with little Pearl. Silvio tried to ignore the 6-year-old. She was too small, too fragile. She reminded him too much of what he had lost in the locket. But Pearl was relentless. She would sit by his chair while he read his engineering books, resting her head on his knee. One night, a blizzard hammered the cabin, shaking the heavy timbers. The wind sounded like screaming banshees. Pearl woke up screaming, thrashing in a night terror. Mary Ellen tried to soothe her, but the child was inconsolable. Silvio stood up. The massive mountain man walked to the loft ladder. He climbed up, the wood groaning. He sat on the edge of the bed and scooped the sobbing child into his arms. He rocked her, awkwardly at first, then with a gentle rhythm. He began to hum. It was a low rumble of a sound, a baritone vibration that seemed to counteract the storm outside. Then he sang. It wasn't a lullaby. It was an old Irish ballad about building bridges and railroads. Drill, ye tarriers, drill, and it's work all day for the sugar in your tay. Pearl's crying stopped. She looked up at his bearded face, traced a scar on his cheek with her tiny finger, and fell asleep against his chest. Mary Ellen watched from the shadows, tears in her eyes. She realized then that Uncle Rook hadn't sold them to a monster. He had sold them to a fortress. But as spring approached, the snow began to melt, revealing the secrets Silvio had kept buried. One evening, Mary Ellen was cleaning the high shelves and knocked over a roll of large blue papers. They unraveled across the floor. They were blueprints, detailed professional architectural drawings stamped with a seal. Silvio Kincaid, Chief Engineer, Union Pacific. You built the railroad, Mary Ellen whispered as Silvio entered the cabin with an armful of wood. Silvio froze. He dropped the wood. I helped. These drawings. Mary Ellen traced the lines. This isn't a cabin. It looks like a mill, a massive one. It's a dream, Silvio said, snatching the papers up. A dead man's dream. Now get the fire going. But the secret was out. Silvio wasn't a hermit by nature. He was a genius in exile. And as the ice cleared from the passes, the world below began to remember him too. April 1875 brought the thaw. The mountains wept melting snow, and the creeks swelled into roaring rivers. The isolation of winter was broken, and with the clear paths came the return of danger. Down in the valley, Elias Rook had not gone to California. The $500 Silvio had paid him had vanished across the poker tables of Deadwood in less than a month. Rook was broke, bitter, and increasingly desperate. He sat in a dimly lit tavern, nursing a cheap beer. Across from him sat a man named Red Morgan. Red was a gun for hire who had killed more men than he had teeth. You say this hermit has gold? Red asked, picking his teeth with a knife. Bags of it, Rook lied, though he remembered the heavy thud of the poke Silvio had thrown. He bought my nieces with pure dust, high grade. He's sitting on a motherlode up there, Red, and he's just one man playing house with 4 useless girls. Red grinned. 1 man, 4 girls, and a mountain of gold. Sounds like a retirement plan. I want half, Rook said, and I want the girls back. I can sell them again in San Francisco. Sure, Elias, Red laughed. Half. Up on the mountain, Silvio knew nothing of the plot, but he sensed the shifting winds. He began to work with a manic energy. He took the girls to a narrow gorge about a mile from the cabin. A roaring waterfall cascaded down a 100-foot drop. Verity, the calculations, Silvio barked. Verity, holding a notebook, scribbled furiously. The flow rate is sufficient, Silvio. If we anchor the turbine here, the torque will drive the main saw. Good. Silvio wasn't just building a home. He was building the Kincaid flume and mill. The timber in these mountains was worth a fortune. Massive ponderosa pines that the lowland loggers couldn't reach because the terrain was too steep to drag logs down. Silvio's plan was brilliant and insane. He would build a water-powered sawmill on the mountain, cut the lumber into planks, and then use a water slide flume, an aqueduct made of wood, to shoot the finished lumber down the mountain to the river below, bypassing the treacherous trails. It was an engineering marvel, and he needed a crew. Mary Ellen, you're the foreman, Silvio ordered. Ruth, your security. Watch the ridge. Verity, you manage the gear ratios. Pearl, You keep the soup hot. For 3 months, they worked like demons. Silvio felled the trees. The girls stripped the bark. They utilized a system of pulleys Silvio designed that allowed even the slender Mary Ellen to move logs weighing a ton. They were building their future. Every plank they cut was money in the bank. Silvio intended to file the patent and the land claim in the girls' names. This was his gift. Not gold, but an industry. A legacy. By July, the great water wheel was in place. It was 20 feet tall, hand-carved from seasoned oak. "Tonight," Silvio said, wiping grease from his forehead, "we test the wheel." The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The girls stood by the river, holding their breath. Silvio released the brake. The water hit the paddles. The wheel groaned, hesitated, and then began to turn. Creak-dick, whoosh, creak-ick, whoosh, faster and faster. The gears engaged. The massive circular saw blades spun with a singing hum that harmonized with the mountain wind. "It works!" Pearl screamed, jumping up and down. Mary Ellen laughed, a sound she hadn't made in years. She hugged Ruth. Silvio stood back, watching them. A rare, crooked smile touched his lips. He had done it. He had built something that would keep them safe forever. Crack! The sound wasn't a breaking branch. It was the distinct, dry snap of a Winchester rifle. Dirt kicked up inches from Silvio's boot. "Cover!" Silvio roared, tackling Pearl and rolling behind a stack of logs. Ruth didn't hesitate. She dove for her rifle, sliding into a ditch. Mary Ellen and Verity scrambled behind the machinery. From the ridge above, laughter echoed down. "That's a mighty fine wheel you got there, Kincaid." Elias Rook's voice drifted down, shrill and hateful. "But I think it belongs to me now." Silvio peeked over the log. There were 6 of them. Rook and 5 hard-looking men with repeaters spread out along the high ground. They had the elevation. They had the numbers. "Uncle Elias!" Mary Ellen shouted, her voice shaking with rage. "Go away!" "Not until I get what's mine!" Rook yelled. "Send out the mountain man, and maybe I won't burn that pretty mill to the ground." Silvio looked at the girls. He looked at the mill, the history they had built. Then he looked at his rifle. "Stay down," Silvio whispered to Pearl. "Do not move." "What are you doing?" Mary Ellen hissed. "I'm drawing their fire," Silvio said calmly. "Ruth, when they look at me, you make them regret it." Silvio Kincaid stood up. He walked out into the open, a giant target against the setting sun. He didn't raise his rifle. He just walked towards the ridge, his face like a thunderhead. "Rook!" Silvio bellowed, his voice shaking the trees. "You sold them. A deal is a deal. Deals change," Red Morgan shouted from beside Rook. He leveled his rifle at Silvio's chest. But Silvio wasn't walking aimlessly. He was walking towards the release lever of the log flume, a lever that held back thousands of gallons of dammed-up water and 5 tons of raw logs waiting to be sent down the mountain. He wasn't going to shoot them. He was going to wash them off the face of the earth. But he had to reach the lever before Red Morgan pulled the trigger. The distance between Silvio and the release lever was 30 yards. To a man with a bullet in his leg, Red Morgan hadn't missed entirely. The slug had torn through Silvio's thigh. It felt like 30 miles. "Fire!" Red screamed, clutching his own shoulder where Ruth's bullet had grazed him. The bandits opened up. Bullets buzzed like angry hornets, chewing up the turf around Silvio. He gritted his teeth, the pain a white-hot lance in his leg, and kept moving. He didn't run. He limped with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide. "Cover him!" Mary Ellen shrieked. Ruth worked the lever of the Winchester like a seasoned soldier. Crack, chick, crack. She dropped one man who was taking a bead on Silvio. Verity, terrified but calculating, grabbed a heavy wrench. She crawled towards the boiler of the steam engine, powering the saw. "Pressure," she muttered to herself. "Release valve." Silvio was 10 yards away. A bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard. "Silvio!" Pearl screamed, breaking cover. "Stay back!" Silvio roared, dragging himself through the mud. Elias Rook, seeing the giant fall, broke into a run. He wasn't heading for Silvio. He was heading for the mill. He held a torch he had lit from the campfire. "I'll burn it all. If I can't have it, nobody can." Silvio saw the fire. He saw his life's work, and the girl's future, about to turn to ash. With a roar that sounded more animal than human, he lunged the final few feet and slammed his fist into the iron release lever. He yanked it down. Kaboom! It wasn't an explosion of gunpowder. but of physics. The holding dam above the mill opened its sluice gates. Thousands of gallons of mountain water, penned up and furious, rushed into the V-shaped flume. But it wasn't just water. The flume was loaded with the day's cut. Massive, heavy logs meant for the river below. The water hit the logs, launching them like battering rams. The flume angled sharply downward, right past the ridge where Red Morgan and his men were positioned. The sound was deafening. The wooden trestle shook as the torrent of water and timber thundered down. "Look out!" Red screamed. But it was too late. The flume had a spillway function Silvio had designed for jams. He kicked the diverter. The water and logs didn't go down the mountain. They spilled over the side, directly onto the attacking bandits. It was a tidal wave of destruction. Tons of water and pine logs crashed onto the ridge. Men were swept away like rag dolls, their rifles useless against the crushing weight of the timber. The ground itself seemed to liquefy. In 10 seconds, the threat on the ridge was gone, washed down to the valley floor in a chaotic slide of mud and wood. Silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the hiss of the steam engine and the dripping of water. But Elias Rook was still there. He had been close enough to the mill to avoid the flood. He stood near the saw, the torch flickering in his hand, his eyes wide with madness. He looked at the devastation, then at the girls. "You!" Rook hissed, pulling a knife. "You witch spawn!" He lunged for Pearl, who was nearest to him. "No!" Mary Ellen sprinted from behind the log stack. Rook was fast, but he was driven by panic. Mary Ellen was driven by love. She didn't have a weapon in her hand. She hit him with a tackle, driving her shoulder into his gut. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the dirt. Rook was stronger. He backhanded her, sending her sprawling, blood trickling from her lip. He raised the knife. "I should have left you in the snow," he screamed. Click! Rook froze. The sound came from right behind his ear. Verity stood there. She was holding Silvio's massive Colt revolver. She was 12 years old, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, but she had used both thumbs to pull the hammer back. "Drop it!" Verity whispered. Rook sneered. "You don't have the guts, little mouse?" "She might not," a voice rasped from the ground. Rook looked up. Silvio had dragged himself to a sitting position. He was bleeding from 2 wounds, his face grey as ash. He held the Sharp's rifle, but the barrel was wavering. "But I do," Silvio said. Rook laughed nervously. "You can't aim, old man. You're bleeding out." "I don't need to aim," Silvio wheezed. "Verity, the valve." Verity's eyes darted to the steam engine next to Rook. She understood. She didn't shoot Rook. She turned the gun and fired at the pressure release valve on the boiler tank, just 2 feet from Rook's head. Ping! The bullet sheared the brass fitting. A jet of superheated steam exploded outward with the force of a bomb. It hit Rook square in the face. He screamed, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and dropped the knife, clutching his scalded eyes. He stumbled backward, blind and screaming, tripping over the very lumber his nieces had cut. He fell hard, rolling down the slope, tumbling away into the dark, muddy ravine where his hired men had washed away. Silence reclaimed the mountain. Mary Ellen scrambled to Silvio. "Silvio! Silvio, look at me!" The giant of a man lay back in the mud, his breathing shallow. The bearskin coat was soaked in red. Did we get them?" he whispered. "We got them!" Mary Ellen sobbed, pressing her hands against his leg wound. "We got them all. You saved us." Silvio looked at the 4 faces hovering over him. Mary Ellen, strong and brave. Ruth, still holding her rifle. Verity, the genius who weaponized steam. And Pearl, holding his hand. "No," Silvio breathed, his eyes closing. "You saved me." And then the darkness took him. History tells us that Silvio Kincaid died that day. The legends say the mountain man gave his life to protect the orphans. But history is often written by people who weren't there. The truth is, Silvio Kincaid was too stubborn to die. The next 3 days were a blur of agony and determination. Mary Ellen became the surgeon, cauterizing the wounds with a knife heated in the fire, just as Silvio had taught her. Ruth hunted for fresh meat to make broth. Verity engineered a brace for his leg, using scrap metal and leather so the bone would set straight. Pearl read to him, hour after hour, refusing to let him slip away into the fever. He woke up on the 4th day. He was weak, half the size he used to be, but the fire in his eyes was back. "The mill," were his first words. "Is the wheel turning?" "It's turning," Mary Ellen smiled, exhausted but triumphant. "And we have an order." "An order?" "A man from the valley came up," Ruth said, cleaning her gun by the window. "Saw the logs wash down the river. Said it was the finest timber he'd ever seen. He wants 10,000 board feet by September." Silvio lay back on the pillow. A slow smile spread across his face. "Then we better get to work." Over the next 5 years, the cabin on the ridge ceased to be a hideout and became the headquarters of an empire. The Kincaid Timber Company revolutionized the logging industry in Wyoming. Silvio's flume design, which he patented in 1876 under the names of all 4 girls, allowed them to transport lumber faster and cheaper than anyone else. But it wasn't just a business, it was a community. Word spread that Kincaid was hiring, but he didn't hire just anyone. He hired men who had been broken by the world, ex-convicts who wanted a second chance, veterans who had lost their way, fathers who needed to feed their families. He paid them fair wages, fed them well, and built town around the base of the flume. They called it Kincaid's Hollow. It was a town without a sheriff, because it didn't need one. Everyone knew that the 4 Kincaid sisters ran the place, and behind them stood the old man of the mountain. You didn't cross the Kincaids. By 1880, the sisters had grown into women who were forces of nature in their own right. Mary Ellen became the face of the company. She traveled to Cheyenne and even Chicago, negotiating contracts with the Union Pacific Railroad. She was known as the Iron Lady of the West, a woman who could discuss philosophy in a ballroom and then out-negotiate a rail baron over whiskey. Ruth became the head of security and logistics. She wore trousers, rode a black stallion, and was arguably the best shot in the territory. No bandits ever tried to raid the mill again. Verity went east to study engineering, one of the first women admitted to a program. She returned with designs that modernized the mill, introducing electricity to the hollow before most cities had it. And Pearl, the little girl who had been sold as useless? She became the heart of the town. She built a school and a hospital with the company profits. She ensured that no child in Kincaid's Hollow ever went hungry or cold. In the winter of 1885, a journalist from the New York Tribune traveled west to interview the mysterious Silvio Kincaid. He expected a savage, a brute. He found an older man, leaning on a cane, sitting on the porch of a beautiful estate that overlooked a thriving town. The man was surrounded by 4 elegant, powerful women. "Mr. Kincaid," the journalist asked, "they say you bought these women for a bag of gold. Is that true?" Silvio looked at the sisters. Mary Ellen was reviewing a ledger. Verity was sketching a turbine. Ruth was watching the perimeter. Pearl was pouring tea. "No," Silvio said softly. "I didn't buy them." "But the story says—" "I invested," Silvio corrected him. "I put everything I had into the only thing that matters. Family." He looked at the journalist with those sharp, flinty eyes. "And let me tell you, son, it was the best bargain in the history of the world." The journalist wrote the story, but he left out the tears in the old man's eyes. However, the story doesn't end with a rocking chair. There was one final twist in the tale of the Kincaids, one that solidified their names in the history books forever. It happened during the Great Blizzard of 1886, a storm so severe it wiped out cattle herds across the plains and threatened to starve the entire territory. The winter of 1886 did not arrive. It invaded. Meteorologists in the East would later call it the Great Die-Up, a sterile name for a season that murdered the frontier. In the Wyoming Territory, the world simply turned white and ceased to exist. By early January 1887, the mercury in the thermometer nailed to the porch of the Kincaid cabin had retreated into the bulb, sitting dead at 60 degrees below zero. The wind was no longer air. It was a physical assault, a razor-filled scream that stripped paint from wood and hope from men's souls. The great cattle herds of the plains, thousands of head of Texas longhorns, drifted southward until they hit the drift fences, where they huddled together and froze upright, statues of ice staring blindly into the void. Up at Kincaid's Hollow, the fortress Silvio had built held the line. The massive Ponderosa logs, notched with obsessive precision 12 years earlier, did not draft. The stone fireplace, fed by the sisters in shifts, roared with the defiance of a blast furnace. They were safe, they were warm, they were wealthy, but silence is a heavy thing, and the silence from the valley floor was deafening. It had been 3 weeks since the last supply train had whistled its way into Blackwater Ridge. The telegraph lines had snapped under the weight of ice in December. The switchback trails leading down the mountain were buried under 30 feet of drift snow. The valley was a tomb, sealed tight by the indifferent hand of nature. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The Kincaid sisters were no longer the terrified children who had huddled under a bearskin coat. They were women grown strong on mountain air and iron will. Ruth, now 28, paced the floor like a caged panther. She stopped at the frosted window, scraping a peephole with her knife. "Still no smoke from the chimneys on the south side of town," she murmured. "The miners' shacks. They've stopped burning wood." "Maybe they ran out," Pearl said softly. At 18, Pearl was the conscience of the family. She sat by the fire, mending one of Silvio's old flannel shirts. "Or maybe they're too weak to chop it. Or maybe they're dead," Ruth said, her voice devoid of pity. "And good riddance." Mary Ellen, seated at the heavy oak table reviewing the company ledgers, looked up. Her face was harder now, etched with the stress of running a timber empire in a man's world. "Ruth," she warned. "Don't Ruth me," the middle sister snapped, turning from the window. "I remember that town, Mary Ellen. I remember the faces of the men who stood on that porch and watched Uncle Elias sell us. I remember the bartender who wouldn't give us water because we couldn't pay. They laughed. They watched 4 little girls get sold to a pimp and a gambler, and they didn't lift a damn finger." Ruth walked to the fire, her eyes blazing brighter than the embers. "Let the winter take them. It's justice. We survived. They didn't have the grit. That's the law of the West." Verity, bent over a drafting table in the corner, didn't look up from her schematics. "The survival rate at these temperatures without fuel is 0, she stated clinically. "Hypothermia sets in within hours. The children will be the first to go. Then the elderly." The mention of children made the room go quiet. In the corner, in his heavy rocking chair, Silvio Kincaid sat watching them. He was an old man now. The years and the old bullet wounds had stiffened his joints. He walked with a cane carved from hickory, and his hair was as white as the snow burying the roof. But his eyes, those dark, flinty eyes that had stared down wolves and bandits, were undimmed. He listened to Ruth's anger. He felt it. For years he had hated civilization. He had hated the hypocrisy of towns and the greed of men. He had come to this mountain to be alone because he found humanity wanting. "Ruth," Silvio said. His voice was a low rumble, gravel rolling in a canyon. Ruth stopped pacing. She respected no man on earth, save this one. "Silvio, do you know why I bought you?" he asked. The sisters exchanged glances. He had never spoken of that day directly, not in deep detail. "Because I saw something," Silvio continued, staring into the fire. "I saw a town full of men who had forgotten they were men. They had become animals, driven by fear and greed. They lost their souls because it was easy." He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "If we sit here, warm and full, with $50,000 worth of timber in the yard, and watch them die, we become them. We become the Salty Dog Saloon. We become Elias Rook." "They wouldn't do it for us," Ruth whispered, though the fire had gone out of her voice. "I didn't raise you to be them," Silvio said sharply. "I raised you to be Kincaids." He looked at Mary Ellen. "The inventory." Mary Ellen closed the ledger. She knew what he was asking. She also knew the financial ruin it implied. "We have 3,000 cords of seasoned pine, ready for the spring markets in Omaha. It's the entire year's profit, Silvio. If we lose it, the company might not survive the debts we took on for the new saw blades. And the coal, 10 tons, stockpiled for the boilers." Silvio nodded. "Burn the debt. Save the town." "How?" Verity interrupted, standing up. She walked to the center of the room. "The trails are gone. We can't take wagons down. Horses would die in chest-deep snow before they reached the first switchback." Silvio looked at the genius engineer he had fostered. "You're the smartest woman in the territory, Verity. You tell me." Verity looked at the window, then at the blueprints on her table. She looked at the massive, dormant structure that dominated the ridge outside, the great Kincaid flume. It was a wooden aqueduct, a marvel of engineering designed to float logs on a cushion of water, but the water was ice now. "The flume," Verity whispered. Her mind began to race, calculating friction coefficients and velocity. It's a suicide run for the structure. It's designed for floating timber, not sliding heavy freight. Can it be done? Silvio asked. If we ice the runners, Verity said, her voice gaining speed, if we bypass the water gate and manually grease the chute with tallow, we could turn it into a gravity slide. We send the logs down first. The momentum will carry them across the frozen river, right to the edge of town. And the coal? Mary Ellen asked. Sleds, Verity said. We build reinforced sleds. We pack the coal, the flour, the meat. We send them down the chute behind the timber. The impact at the bottom will destroy the flume, Verity added, her face pale. The G-force at the curve. The wood will shatter. We'll be destroying the mill's lifeline. It will take 2 years to rebuild. Silvio didn't hesitate. Wood grows back. People don't. Get to work. For the next 48 hours, the Kincaid sisters waged war against the cold. They worked in shifts, wrapped in layers of wool and buffalo hide, their breath freezing in clouds around their heads. Ruth and Mary Ellen moved the logs, thousands of them. They rolled the massive trunks to the head of the flume. It was back-breaking labor. The machinery was frozen, so they used leverage, ropes, and sheer grit. Inside the workshop, Verity and Pearl built the sleds. They took shipping crates and reinforced them with iron bands, creating crude torpedoes capable of surviving a 3-mile slide down the mountain. They packed them with every spare ounce of food in the larder, sacks of beans, dried venison, coffee, and coal. Silvio, unable to do the heavy lifting, stood at the control lever of the flume. He oiled the mechanism, fighting the frost that tried to weld the iron shut. He watched his daughters work, his heart swelling with a pride that was warmer than any fire. On the evening of January 28th, the preparations were complete. The moon was high and full, illuminating the white hellscape in a spectral blue light. The temperature was 55 below. "Ready?" Silvio called out, his hand on the release gate. "Ready!" Mary Ellen shouted from the loading deck. "Let her fly!" Silvio roared. He threw the lever. The first log dropped into the ice-slicked chute. Gravity took hold. It accelerated instantly, a dark missile against the white snow. Whoosh! Then the next, and the next. The sound began as a rumble, then grew into a roar that shook the mountain. The logs picked up speed, hitting 60 miles an hour as they screamed down the winding wooden trestle. Down in Blackwater Ridge, the silence was broken. In the frozen interior of the Salty Dog Saloon, a dozen survivors were huddled under rotting blankets. O'Malley, the old bartender, was holding a rosary, his fingers black with frostbite. He heard the thunder. "Avalanche," he croaked. "It's finally here." They huddled closer, waiting for the white wave to bury them. But the roar didn't come from above. It came from the river. Crack, thud, smash. The first log shot out of the bottom of the flume, flew through the air, and skidded across the frozen surface of the river, coming to a rest just yards from the main street. Then another. Then 100. Then 1,000. It was a bombardment of salvation. The massive pine logs piled up on the ice, a chaotic mountain of fuel. Then came the sleds. Verity had calculated the angle perfectly, but the structure couldn't hold the weight of the coal sleds at that speed. As the final sled screamed down the track, the lower trestle of the flume began to groan. High on the mountain, the sisters watched in horror and awe. "It's buckling!" Verity screamed. The bottom quarter of the flume, the masterpiece of the Kincaid mill, disintegrated. Splinters the size of spears flew into the night air. The structure collapsed in a cloud of snow and shattered timber. But the sleds were already through. They tumbled onto the river ice, bursting open, spilling black coal and sacks of flour onto the white snow. Silence returned to the valley. "We did it," Pearl whispered, shivering violently. "We aren't done," Ruth said, strapping on her snowshoes. "Now we make sure they know what to do with it." The descent took them 4 hours. The sisters walked down the buried trail, navigating by moonlight. When they walked into Blackwater Ridge, they looked like Valkyries descending from myth. Ruth kicked open the door of the Salty Dog. The hinges shattered. The huddled mass of people looked up, terrified. They saw 4 figures in buffalo coats, ice frozen in their hair, their faces masked against the wind. "Get up," Ruth barked. O'Malley squinted. "Kincaid, there is wood on the river," Mary Ellen announced, her voice cracking with exhaustion. 3,000 cords. There is coal, there is food. If you want to live, get up and move." The townspeople stumbled out. When they saw the mountain of timber on the ice, enough wood to burn for 100 winters, grown men fell to their knees and wept. But the Kincaid sisters didn't let them weep. They organized. Ruth put a rifle in the hands of the strongest man. "Guard the food, no hoarding. Everyone gets a share." Pearl set up a triage in the church. She started fires, melted snow for broth, and began treating the frostbite. Verity showed the men how to drag the logs without exhausting themselves. Mary Ellen stood in the center of town, the commander-in-chief. For 3 days, the sisters ran Blackwater Ridge. They saved the town. They dragged the dying back from the brink. And in doing so, they killed the ghosts of the past. The people of Blackwater Ridge no longer looked at them as the souled girls. They looked at them with a reverence reserved for saints. When the Chinook wind finally blew in February, raising the temperatures and breaking the siege of winter, the Kincaid sisters prepared to leave. The town council, what was left of it, came to them. "We can't pay you," the mayor stammered. "That timber, it was a fortune. We have nothing." Mary Ellen looked at the ruined flume visible on the mountainside, a jagged scar against the trees. She knew the company was effectively bankrupt. They would have to start over. "You don't owe us money," Mary Ellen said. "Just remember who saved you, and remember that the next time a stranger needs help, you don't turn your back." They climbed back up the mountain to find Silvio sitting on the porch. He was wrapped in blankets, looking frail. The stress of the night and the bitter cold had taken a toll his old heart couldn't quite pay. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "They're alive, Silvio," Pearl said, kneeling beside him. "They're all alive." Silvio smiled. It was a look of pure, unadulterated peace. "Good, that's good." He looked at the destroyed flume. "We broke the slide." "We can build it again," Verity said, though tears were streaming down her face. "I have new designs. Better ones. Steel supports." "I know you do," Silvio murmured. He closed his eyes. "I'm tired, girls. I think I'll rest now." Silvio Kincaid died that spring, just as the first wildflowers were pushing through the mud of the valley floor. He didn't die in a gunfight or a mining accident. He died holding the hands of the 4 women he had saved, who had in turn saved him. The funeral was the largest event in the history of the territory. They came from Cheyenne, from Laramie, and from every shack in Blackwater Ridge. The coffin was carried by the very men who had once stood by and watched Elias Rook sell his nieces. They carried Silvio up the ridge with tears in their eyes. The sisters didn't want a marble monument. Silvio hated stone. He loved living things. So, on the high ridge overlooking the valley, right where he used to sit and watch the sunset, they planted 4 ponderosa saplings. 1 for Mary Ellen, 1 for Ruth, 1 for Verity, and 1 for Pearl. The empire of the Kincaid Timber Company rose again, bigger than before. Mary Ellen became a legend of industry, the timber queen who helped build the state of Wyoming. Verity's patents for hydroelectric power brought light to the West. Ruth served as the first female marshal in the county, her reputation alone enough to keep the peace. And Pearl founded the Kincaid Home for Orphans, ensuring that no child in the territory ever felt unwanted again. But they always returned to the ridge. Decades later, hikers would find that spot. The 4 trees had grown massive, their roots intertwined so tightly that you couldn't tell where one began and the other ended. They formed a canopy, a cathedral of pine needles and bark, sheltering a simple rough-hewn rock. If you go there today, kneel down and brush away the moss. You can still read the words Verity carved with a chisel and hammer, her hands steady and strong. "Here lies Silvio Kincaid. He bought 4 souls with a bag of gold, and in return, he gave the world a family." What a journey! From a terrified huddle on a saloon porch to the queens of a timber empire, the Kincaid sisters proved that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the storm comes. Silvio Kincaid could have walked away. He could have saved his gold and lived in silence. But he made the choice that changed history. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If you were standing in that saloon, watching injustice happen, would you have the courage to slam your gold on the barrel? Or would you turn away? If this story of the mountain man and his 4 daughters moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these forgotten legends. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss a story from the untamed West. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the hardest hearts can be thawed. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next trail.